You are listening to the Small Town Big Arts podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Kirshner, the CEO of the Academy Center of the Arts in Lynchburg, Virginia. In my own work as an arts leader, I have found it difficult to access resources for arts organizations and artists serving smaller communities. On each episode, Small Town Big Arts sets out to drive conversations and provide inspiration for those serving smaller communities through the arts. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us and share with your friends and colleagues who are working to promote the arts in smaller communities across America. You can also learn more by visiting us at smalltownbigarts.com. Hello and welcome to this month's episode. I'm very excited to introduce to the audience a new book called Rural Arts Management that is going to be available for pre-order on June 19th through Routledge. You can go to routledge.com. I think you can also probably find it on Amazon. But in discovering that this book was about to be released, I wanted to get the authors onto the podcast and talk a little bit about the work that they've done in and around this Rural Arts Management textbook that's about to be released. So I'm excited to welcome to the podcast our two guests. First, Jerome Socolof is an associate professor in arts management in the Fine and Performing Arts Department at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. In addition to working in higher education, he has worked for Ashlawn Opera and the Lake George Music Festival, and he also maintains a busy schedule as a grant panelist and consultant. Jerome's research work focuses on the use of outreach programs as engines of public value by nonprofit organizations and arts administration in rural communities. Jerome holds a BM in music business from SUNY Potsdam and both an MA in arts policy and administration and a PhD in arts education with a concentration in cultural policy and administration from The Ohio State University. Elise Lael Kieffer currently serves as a program director and assistant professor of nonprofit leadership studies at Murray State University. She also serves as the executive director of the Nonprofit Resource Center, which provides technical support and professional development for nonprofit organizations across West Kentucky. She holds a PhD in arts administration from Florida State University, an MPA from Tennessee State University, and a BFA from Jacksonville University. Her research focuses include developing capacity at nonprofit arts organizations serving rural communities and improving communication between rural arts organizations and public funding agencies. And her consultation practice focuses on intersector collaboration. So you all, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Small Town Big Arts.
Thanks for inviting us.
Well, the first thing, we're having a little back and forth. So the first thing I wanted to ask you all is what inspired the writing of this book? You all are both obviously scholars and work very specifically in arts administration. But maybe as we get started here, share a little bit about why this book.
You want to go first, Elise?
Well, I was going to suggest you because you invited me into the project, and I'm happy to talk about how I got into rural arts administration, but you are the book founder.
All right. So getting into rural as a research subject, it's personal for me. I grew up in a small town, in fact, small enough it wasn't even a town, it was a village in central New York. And that was, as I now realize, a very specific post-industrial iteration of rural. Went to college in a rural community, lived for a few years in rural central Virginia. So a fair amount of experience with it. And it was while conducting some research at the start of my career in academia, I realized these spaces exist. There's audiences there. There's arts and culture there.
Yep.
How come that's not anywhere in the literature? And so started in doing some research on that, and that led to a project looking at funding levels in rural communities from state arts agencies, which I was actually presenting at a conference in fall of 2019, when also in that same session, we had Elise, who was presenting her dissertation research. After the conference, an editor from Routledge reached out to ask if I'd be interested in writing a book on rural arts management. We had some back and forth to figure out, was it feasible? How should it be framed? Does it work? And luckily, the two things that we landed on were, yes, it's feasible and necessary. And also, holy cow, was I I should not be the only person writing this. That additional perspective and experience was really important. And so this was right around the time that actually Elise found herself wrapping up dissertation work and starting on the tenure track. And I thought, I know exactly who the right person to reach out to would be. And luckily for me, after asking a tough but fair set of questions to make sure that she wasn't getting a bad deal out of this, Elise said yes. And that's sort of what brought us here. So
Perfect.
let's hear your side of it, Elise.
So I come from very much the opposite side. I grew up in Columbia, Maryland, which is a suburb between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Upper middle class suburb. Every opportunity that we could want within a 40-minute drive. All of, some of the nation's best arts and culture within a 40-minute drive, the museums, all of that. And I pursued a performance career, and then I started a nonprofit career, and was working in Manhattan and fundraising. And then I moved to the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, with my young family, and discovered that my skills and education and training didn't translate.
Interesting. Okay.
Or at least minimally translated.
Yeah.
And here I was, reasonably intelligent, educated person with lots of experience, feeling like a complete neophyte. And that didn't seem right to me. It didn't seem that it should be so hard to find resources for someone that was trying to do a good job in their rural community. And I didn't want to approach it in the way that has traditionally been approached across rural communities, which is, well, I know a better way to do that, right? That was not who I wanted to be.
Yeah.
And so that's ultimately actually what inspired me to continue my education and get the PhD. Was this area is unspoken for and needs to be spoken for, and how can I be a part of that conversation? So I was trying to approach it from an anti-colonial mindset of what do these people need and how can I be part of helping with that, as opposed to knowing what they should be doing.
Well, I love this because the genesis of this book is similar actually to the Small Town Big Arts Project, which really was, I had begun, I was on a sabbatical, and I had went back to my small hometown to help them with a strategic planning process, and discovered there was very little resources for small town arts delivery. And I was very excited to see this book. I think as we get started into our conversation, I think what you all certainly recognize, what I certainly recognize, and certainly anyone in a rural community recognizes, is that rural is really diverse. Like when we're talking about what is rural, where is rural, you could be on the shores of Alaska, you could be in the swamplands of Florida, you could be in the mountains of Kentucky, right? It is really a complex ecosystem, and no community is quite the same. There's certainly regional ties that folks share, but each is different. But there is some unifying elements that exist across smaller communities. So I'm curious, as we get started. Now, the book designates rural as under 45,000 in regards to population. So as we get started, I want to kind of share that, because we'll be talking about communities under 45,000, which I think is a great designation and makes a lot of sense. So when you also, I love that you coined this phrase, critical rural theory. Will you all share a little bit with me about this term, which obviously is a play on critical race theory, but critical rural theory? Tell me a little bit.
So I don't have the book in front of me, but I can't take credit for coining that. There is a book dedicated to critical rural theory.
Oh, interesting.
And if you have notes in the podcast, I can definitely share that citation.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I'll
Yes,
put it in
I am not the scholar who coined that phrase. And if it's okay, Jerome, I'm going to take this one, at least start it. So the critical theories, there's a whole family of theories. Critical race theory is, the atomic bomb of cable news, and that's the one that the majority of people have heard of. which is not what the majority of people think that it is. It is an academic theory, right?
Yeah.
That looks at systems and structures and policies as they relate to a particular group of people. So the critical theories really were Freire that first started looking at them, and it was just critical theory, pedagogy of the oppressed, and how we can look at those institutions, policies, structures, all of those things from a different perspective, from the perspective of the oppressed. And so, and oppression, again, also just a voice that hasn't been included in the past.
Yeah.
So there is critical feminist theory, there is critical queer theory, there is critical race theory, there is critical rural theory. So the idea behind critical rural theory being that the majority of our cultural policy and decision-making has been urban-centric. It's been done with the idea of the major legacy arts organization, which is, your major performing arts center or your theater or your opera house or your symphony, whatever those organizations are that are operating in major metropolitan centers, with all of that includes
And
access to
deeply embedded in
infrastructure,
power
access to
structures
funding,
too.
right?
Yeah.
And that does not include the rural community that has access to none of those things.
Okay, so that's great. Thank you. I think that will help frame this conversation in a lot of great ways. So when we talk about that, what did you all find that you're seeing kind of over and over again, or consistently for arts delivery in rural communities, the challenges that they're facing that may not exist for these larger urban market organizations, right, that are part of this established infrastructure, a part of the power systems that sort of exist in the United States? What were you all seeing that was popping up?
Well, the one thing that immediately comes to mind is infrastructure. If you are in a large city or even a suburban, heck, we'll throw an exurban area, you likely have access to schools that may have their own arts infrastructure, perhaps some measure of theaters, space you may not own your own space, but you have access to, could be rented. You move into rural spaces, and interestingly, a century ago, most towns in the US had what they would likely call an opera house, and now are just sort of small community theaters. But a lot of those have been converted or they've been torn down. A lot of rural communities, due to school consolidation, don't even necessarily have that built-in school educational institution infrastructure. And so in these spaces where people are looking to make art and create art, share art, teach art, they don't actually have the necessary facilities. And so we see a lot of places where people are figuring out how to make things work almost in spite of that dearth of resources in infrastructure. And we can also sort of tack on to that supply infrastructure. So if they're looking to bring artists in, they're looking to source materials needed for the work, it is substantially more difficult to make arrangements to get folks and get things into some of these rural spaces that may potentially be a few hours from the nearest airport or train station than it would be to ask them to fly into an airport and then grab an Uber or a taxi to a place that is 30 minutes away. So infrastructure is the one that comes to top of mind for me.
Well, and I think even about how that plugs into a lot of government, particularly state funding. So I've had some conversations with Virginia Commission for the Arts, and I serve on the Virginians for the Arts Board here in Virginia. And one of the issues that they've run into, they're trying to make sure that their dollars are reaching every jurisdiction in the state of Virginia, but in some counties, there isn't a traditional, nonprofit arts organization that would apply and receive the funds. So they're actively trying to identify, okay, libraries, what are some other infrastructure that we can plug into right now to get these dollars into these communities? And so definitely seeing that.
Yay, libraries, right? Exceptional supporters of the arts and culture in small towns everywhere. And as you said, in places where there is no other resource, they have traditionally been places, not just of the arts, but of gathering, community centers and all of that. So I think libraries are underappreciated and undervalued, and they play such a high role in rural communities. I've seen performances in the quiet space of the library. I've seen live performances in rural cities, and that's just exceptional. So general success story of the library, yay. All my librarian friends will be happy that I said that. What I think, our book has case studies that are both domestic in the US and international, and we tried to be diverse also in our rural examples. As you mentioned, some of them are in indigenous communities, which we're not specifically qualified to dive deep in, but certainly using it as an example of incredible collaborations and rural outreach, as well as across the US and in the polar regions and the Midwest and the South, and just trying to be diverse so that we can show the commonalities. And the one, rather than giving a very specific success story, I think the commonality that exists in all of those regions, both within the US and internationally, is organizations succeed when they work together.
So when you talk about working together internally within the community or externally beyond the community?
So both internally within the community. And this is where I think a lot of the urban-centered arts management practices get it wrong in rural communities, in this one area of the insulation of the organization. In a rural community, we just can't operate that way. We have to be part of our community, or we are irrelevant to our community. And our communities have limited human resources and limited financial resources and limited infrastructure. So if we are not willing to share, we're not going to succeed.
Yeah.
It has to inform every decision.
Yep. And I think you're right that urban organizations can learn a lot from rural organizations. Absolute need, right, to be deeply interconnected across, across lots of, social service organizations, local governments, area businesses, right, is critical to their survival. And I think in a moment, right, where urban arts are crunched, they could probably learn a lot in regards to that those types of collaborative efforts. That's awesome to hear, because I'm finding that too. I'm finding very often that where we're seeing the most success are those communities that have clearly integrated themselves fully in the community, and therefore the community sees and understands the value of that institution really, really deeply. And then in turn, because they care about it, they care for it, and on and on and on and on and on. I want to actually talk a little bit, because you all did some look internationally. I want to speak to that a bit, because that'll be new. It's certainly new for me. What did you all find when you took a look at rural from an international perspective?
It's interesting what happens when you strip away the distinctly American expectation of rugged individualism, because, and I'll just speak for the international cases that I wrote for my chapters, a lot of them came from a place exactly what Elise was just talking about, where the default assumption is community, and it is collaborative, and it is everyone working together, as opposed to with the US, the ethos is very much, it is siloed, it is individualistic. And it was very interesting to see some of the distinctions that arise when, our domestic examples, we have places that are looking to, okay, what can we do? How do we engage our community and collaborate? As opposed to many of the international ones, it's, okay, we as a community, how do we support something that works for us? How do we sort of manifest? And so that, to me, has really been the biggest distinction between looking at US-based and international.
Jerome, what I love about that, so right now, I'm going through this SMU Data Arts rural data, it's a part of their arts vibrancy study. And the theme that essentially came back for me and looking about, it was about 2025 communities that they identified all over the United States. And there's, there are, the data is looking at very specific things oriented to what they classify as arts dollars. So these are, people both spending money on the arts as well as people employed in the arts, government funding for the arts, private foundations, that all of this is being looked at. And over and over again, each of the organizations that were clearly a big part of making the arts happen in these small communities, and all the organizations were different. I mean, even down to CDCs and arts education focused, mural programs, lots of things. But what was clear was that there was a collective community effort to make it happen, right? That it took a community-wide agreement, essentially, whether conscious or unconscious, to engage in this, to invest in this, to be a part of it, to value it, to push it forward. So it's interesting to hear that is what you found internationally, and that so much of the American ethos, right, is do it on your own, right? Rugged individualism, but that very much the success of so many of these rural communities in regards to arts vibrancy is a collective communal effort. So that's really interesting to hear back from what you all found. So when we look at this engagement, this coming together, this collective impact, how would you all describe or explain how an organization authentically, earnestly connects to its community? I mean, what are we talking about when we're saying that?
So one of the distinctions that we have to make in this book early on that carries through the whole text is what we classified as year-round rural and tourist destination.
Yes.
So this is, when I moved to what I call the middle of nowhere from Manhattan, the county has 6,500 people. The town has 1,600 people. The closest big city is a population of 40,000, and that's 45 minutes away. And that's the big city where there's a Walmart, right? So right. That is the year-round rural. There's nothing specifically drawing people there during the year at one time to bolster the economy. Versus someplace like Cooperstown, New York, right? Where you've got people going to the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame once a year. And so this very otherwise equally rural town is huge in the summer, right?
Yeah, well, and I'll share with you all really quick, right? The SMU most arts vibrant small community is Jackson, Wyoming, right? Where ski tourism, right? Obviously that community inflates and deflates with the ski season. So absolutely, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
And so we talk about engagement as it relates to two very different populations of people. We have to, and this is just going to carry right over with the conversation that we've been having this whole time about how we can't responsibly engage with the people that live and support and work in our communities if we're only thinking about those big dollars that are going to come in every summer or every winter or whatever that season is. We have to engage with both of those communities. And so does that mean that and this is an institutional or organizational decision, does that mean that we lower our prices when it's not high tourist season? Does it mean we do different programming when it's not tourist season? How are we making sure that the people that are sustaining our organization and work in our organization and are living in this town that shelters our organization are able to interact with the organization?
Yeah.
And by doing that, then we're responsible neighbors, right? We're responsible citizens in our community. We're engaging with them, and then we matter to them, whether we have a big population of people coming in or not.
Well, I'm probably less prone to downturns in the economy, right? The tourism is big when the economy is doing well. When the economy isn't doing well, tourism drops. So I would imagine too, the sustainability, the longevity, the strength of these institutions is going to be stronger if they're actually embedded and have value to the people who live there and not just the people from outside.
That's right. And one of the case studies that I did had to do with human resources, and it was an international study, and it was really beautiful. That they were trying to build a cultural tourism village. So it wasn't just one organization. Again, we're talking about that, right? Like it's community wide. But rather than bringing in qualified people from outside, they brought in people to train local citizens to do the jobs that needed to be done. So there was a strategic effort on the front end to train local people to run these organizations, to run these facilities, so that instead of, oh, what a lovely quaint place, I'd like to retire here, I'm going to have a great job while I live here. No, the people that already live there can do that job. They just need to learn how. They've never done it before, but they're fully able to do it. So let's teach them.
Well, and authenticity is really important, right? I think, we were kind of alluding to this earlier, this idea that, an urbanite is going to come and bestow their great urban knowledge upon a community is just not going to fly, right? We need to feel a sense of authenticity. Well, I will share, I in the work I've been doing, I've been sort of coining names for different types of organizations I see in different places. And I have seen examples, and I call it the enclave, where art side artists have made a home in a place, and found success. But most often when they do, there are a couple factors going on. One is that the somebody with the organization is originally from the community, right? There is somebody, right, that is an advocate or can be a connective tissue to the history and the institutions of the place. And or the artists that are there very, very, very much honor and respect and highlight and celebrate that place, right? As opposed to and use their skills to do so, as opposed to I'm coming here to show you this great culture that I brought to you from the outside. Was that something that you all saw or found in your research too, as sort of a reverse of that ever, where people were coming in from the outside?
Less so from research and more honestly personal experience. Part of why there tends to be, well, I'll say distrust when sort of somebody from an outside area. It doesn't even necessarily have to be an urban area, but just somebody from outside of the community comes in. There is that fear that they're coming here and they are going to basically talk down to us. They are going to tell us what we should do, what we should appreciate. And clearly, as a community, the community could say, look, we're here. We've been here for a while. We must be doing something right.
Yeah.
And so organizationally, really the best things that somebody can do, even if they're coming into the community from elsewhere, is don't talk down, don't make assumptions, and also be willing to be taught. Learn the community, learn from the community. You're not just making this a one-way street. In fact, Elise and I were recently at a conference, the Association of Arts Administration Educators, and one of the talks that came up at that conference was about how we've moved away from the verbiage of outreach, because outreach is very unidirectional. And as I say this, I realize it was in my intro bio, so I need to go edit that at some point. And really move towards the verbiage of engagement and this idea that it does have to be a two-way street. Like I think of the place where I grew up, and it's about 8,000 people. And it is the sort of small town where, while I was born and raised in that village, because my parents had moved there, I wasn't really a local. Yeah. And there is sort of that element of distrust. And there's tied up in the industrial history some reasoning for that. But whether I look at organizations and rural spaces in New York, Virginia, Ohio, wherever, the ones who seem to have really found that toehold and make good inroads with their communities are those ones who say, look, we would love to be in this space. We are not here as interlopers. We are not here to tell you. We are here to learn from you, learn with you, work with you. We want to be part of this community. We're not here to tell you how to make your community. And that little thing makes such a huge difference.
Yeah, yeah. I 100% see that too, over and over and over and over and over again. Um, I I think I want to go back to infrastructure for a moment because I think that when we talk about the work, right, if we talk about the artwork being produced and created, obviously that authenticity, the value that's established has to be something that is deeply rooted in that place and deeply a part of that place. And then we have the the buildings, the facilities, the equipment, right, that need to house and hold the work. And this is over and over again very clearly a really major challenge for smaller communities that lack a lot of the wealth. Uh, Very often too, a tradition of public giving, public participation, right, from governments and local governments in regards to things like cultural infrastructure. But I did notice in the preview there was a chapter on capital campaigns. And if we could get a little into that, because as an arts administrator, I've myself been directly involved in capital campaigns and fairly large capital campaigns that took a huge amount of internal infrastructure to accomplish, as well as a whole bunch of resources that came from the federal level, the state level, the local level, philanthropy, foundations, right, all over the map. And we need space, right? We need spaces to gather. We need spaces to create the work. Tell me a little bit about that chapter because that jumped out at me, and I thought this is something I would love to share with the audience because I haven't tackled this as much in the podcasts. And so, tell me a little bit about what you all found in regards to capital campaigns.
Yeah, and I laugh as you ask the question because this is the chapter that has far and away my favorite case study in it. Specifically, this is the chapter where we have a case study on the Canadian Potato Museum.
I love it.
Yes, we'll circle back to that. With capital campaigns in rural spaces, it honestly comes down to a relatively small handful of adjustments from how one might approach them in a more resource-rich or densely populated area. And part of it is you don't have to go it alone. And this ties back to that idea of collaboration and cooperation. I know I mentioned earlier, 100 years ago, every town in the US had a community theater or an opera house. And a lot of those have been converted to other usages. And so what we're seeing now are organizations and communities who are looking to basically do the opposite, convert some other structure that's available into usage for that purpose, rather than it being an undertaking that is only serving one organization. It creates wonderful opportunity to ask, all right, we can make use of this part of the time or part of the facility. Who else would benefit from this? Because this is a situation where the more folks you can get involved in the work of fundraising, planning, really activating the campaign, the easier it's going to be, and also the easier a sell it becomes. If you are, say, the director of a small community theater, you might be able to go to the bank in town, assuming the town has a bank, or the other shops in town, and say, "Hey, this is what we're looking to do. Might you be able to sponsor? Might you be able to help?" And they'll be able to contribute to an extent, but there are a lot of other organizations and a lot of other folks making similar asks. It's not a huge shock that the need outstrips supply consistently when it comes to fundraising. But if you are able to go and say, "Hi, I'm from this organization. These are my friends. They're from this organization, this organization, this organization.
Yeah.
Would you be able to help, or can we discuss how you might be able to support our work? We are fundraising to do this. Also, here is how it serves the community." It really moves away from that idea of it is an individual, or in this case, individual organization pursuit, towards one of this is a collective pursuit. How do we find something? How do we create something that is going to serve multiple organizations, a whole lot of people, and really become an integral part of the community? And that's sort of the biggest shift I found in working on that chapter.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now you have to tell me about the Potato Museum. You have to.
Yes,
You can't
yes.
lead with that, Jerome, and then just not follow up. We have
It needs to be told.
Yeah. So this is this one has a special place in my heart because I actually learned of the existence of this museum. It's on Prince Edward Island while I was on my honeymoon. Turns out, actually, not the only potato museum in the Canadian Maritimes. Um,
Okay.
so I have to be clear: this is the Prince Edward Island one, not the New Brunswick one. Um, and I was trying to find a good case study for capital campaigns. And because of the way the United States funds arts and culture, it was really difficult to find a good example from outside the US
Yeah.
because most other places have much better public support, and this would be sort of a non-issue. And this museum, it is not a terribly large museum. Budget is not huge, but they do good trade. After all, tourism is a big chunk of the PEI economy. It's basically tourism, fishing, and Anne of Green Gables. And people need something to do when they're not fishing or trying to track down Gilbert. And so, this is a big tourist draw. And I don't even remember how on earth I came across this approach they use to fundraising, because they have consistent fundraising needs, really to deal with their facility, to make sure that they actually have the spaces they need, beyond just the exhibits themselves. And what they stumbled on, because potatoes are such a big part of the PEI economy, is they actually launched into a partnership with a grocery chain in the Maritimes and a number of potato farmers, where on an ongoing basis, for each bag of potatoes sold from this growing collective through this chain, a portion of that comes back to the Potato Museum, and those funds are then used to help with their capital expenses, facility upkeep, and occasionally renovation and growth. And so rather than say, we are the Potato Museum, money please, because again, limited, I mean, PEI is not a terribly large province, so
Yeah.
limited resources, they found this alternative way to go about something. They found a place that people went, the grocery store. They knew that potatoes were a big part of the local culture and local cuisine, and they figured out a way to have their needs met, but in a way that also tied them in with elements of the community and really made it feel very natural. And so that was one of my favorite examples from the entirety of the book, because potatoes, which is just wonderful on its own, but also how they found such a novel way to go about it.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's one of the things that and this is not just in small communities, but I think it's even particularly more difficult in small communities. Facility depreciation is a real destroyer of institutions and organizations. Very, very often the weight of a building, owning a building and maintaining that building in the American nonprofit sphere is really difficult. And again, also not just in the arts, right? This moves across lots of organizations.
If,
So
if I
coming up with,
may,
yes,
if I
yes.
may, because that is such an example of, we started the conversation and we talked a minute about critical rural theory, right? And the idea of the theory is that the way that it's been done elsewhere might not work for this group of people, right? For whichever theory we're talking about. So we're still looking at it with this benchmark of, this is what a concert hall is meant to look like. This is what a theater performance is meant to look like.
Mm-hmm.
Says who?
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe
yeah.
that's not what it needs to look like in my community. And maybe, wild idea, by doing it the way that works in my community, I'm not wrong. Maybe my way of doing it is different, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong or less. It's different because in my community, it's the way that it makes sense.
And
And so we have
and
to
probably
stop
right.
right? So we have to stop comparing. And yes, I understand. I have a theater background. I understand that there are certain things that we hope to have for a theatrical performance, but this wild innovation, right? We have to break out of those boxes that were built for urban centers.
Yeah.
All of them. Just break them all.
Yeah. Well, one of the, I think of non-traditional even spaces themselves, or even utilizing things that aren't space. I think one of the, earlier in my career, one of the ways that we produced theater in rural settings was outdoor site specific work, because it didn't require buildings, facilities, and then it also embraced the landscape of where we were in like really specific ways. So I think for people to begin to think too, beyond the buildings. I mean, buildings I think are important in a lot of regards, but But I've also seen, a few times, and actually even the genesis of this podcast was the organization in the small town where I grew up. It was a converted church that they had taken. And Jerome, your story too of multiple partners in a facility and space, and again, rethinking about how we think about even cultural partnerships, right? They have a bunch of for-profit and nonprofit organizations that utilize what used to be classrooms in this church as office spaces. So there's a yoga studio in one of them. I'm pretty sure there's a social service organization that houses themselves there, a coffee shop set up in one of the other spaces, and then the main hall of the church is a performance space that operates and does a bunch of different things throughout the year. But I do think taking a look at what you have and then who can work with you, right, is a critical component. So I think, and I think, Elise, you're right. I love this idea, the right way is your way in the community, right? Elise, actually, tell me, you're in Western Kentucky, and I had a chance to early going in this podcast. I talked to Apple Shop in Eastern Kentucky.
Mhm.
And Eastern Kentucky is mountain country
Right.
and Appalachia, and they're when we talk about an institution, right, that is deeply embedded in place, right, and
Right.
clearly formed value in that place. Apple Shop is like a fantastic example of that. Um, Tell me a little bit about Western Kentucky. Tell me a little bit about what you see there, and also you are an outsider coming in. So how does it how if we could get a little bit into that, your new home.
Well, for clarity, the community where I moved that was the middle of nowhere is actually Appalachia. It was in South Central Kentucky, and I was an outsider there and navigated all of those things. Um, Murray State University is in West Kentucky, so I've been here for 3 years. And what I will tell you about West Kentucky is one of the defining things about the whole region is that it is not the big city and it is not Appalachia. It is
Ah,
defined, right? It's
yeah.
defined by what it is not. And the resources that are funneled to Louisville and Lexington and Appalachia in Eastern Kentucky. And
Yeah.
they're like, hi, we're here. We're
Yeah.
Kentucky too. Um, and in my time here, I have taken so many calls from even state agencies saying, we're supposed to, our mandate is the whole state, and the furthest west we go is Bowling Green, or the furthest west we go is maybe for maybe a little bit further west than that. But can you help us reach actual West Kentucky? And so it's the identity here is there is its own thread of independence, right? But it's not, well, lots of small towns have their own brand of independence, but here it's like, nope, okay, fine. We'll just take care of ourselves. That's fine. We've got this.
Yeah.
By regional authority, we're actually under the Delta Regional Authority. There is no one here that identifies as being a part of the Delta region.
Hmm.
But that's where our regional resources would come from. And so that's part of the like black hole of resources is in that we're not Appalachia, we're not the Delta region, but that's where our resources should come from. So we have to try to identify as that it's an interesting vortex.
Yeah, it's and I find it really interesting, this idea of defining yourself too by what you're not instead of what you are.
Yeah.
And and so much of I think rural sustainability and development, right, isn't around being something, being someplace. How do you all see the arts as being a part of that work of helping a place um, give give a place a sense of place, a sense of identity, meaning, so much of what, I think we have right now in regards to cultural divide is this sort of broad definition of rural, broad definition of urban. But of course, each of these communities is really unique. Each of these communities has its own cultural traditions, and identifiers. Um, how do you all see the arts as a part of that? You know, whether we're looking at Western Kentucky or whether we're looking at you know, rural community in Alaska or Wisconsin, how do you see that?
I think um, I think what the arts really allow these communities is the opportunity to claim ownership of identity, because as you both just mentioned, and we can trace this back a few hundred years at least, rural communities have been defined A, by outsiders, and B, by what they're not. And in fact, even early on in our research and talking with each other over the project, one of the things we kept running up against was it's almost impossible to find a single definition of what constitutes rural, even within the US government definitions. Say, what's rural? Well, it's not urban. What's urban? Okay, that we can tell you. And so these are definitions being made from outside of that community to define that community. And they're not even really defining the community. They're defining other communities and saying, see all those spaces where this community is not, that's this other thing.
Yeah.
And so in establishing arts and culture, ventures, institutions, practices, whatever, it finally gives an opportunity for these communities to say, look, this is who we are. This is what we are. You want to come and join us? We'd love to have you, but we get to define what we are and how it works and how it looks here.
Yeah, it's empowering, right? Culture is power.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. Um, well, as we're sort of coming to the end and wrapping up, I wanted to see if you see any trends that are emerging in this, what we'll coin the rural arts field. We few, we proud here. Um, what do you all see? Do you see anything emerging right now?
I
Um,
think,
Sorry.
no, please.
I was just going to say one big one is, at least that I have seen, is we're finally getting some acknowledgement that this is not just an issue of inequality, but also one of inequity, from fairly powerful stakeholders. A large number of state arts agencies have realized that, you know, they're granting programs are not designed in a way that gives small organizations, rural organizations, organizations that may be volunteer driven as opposed to having a full-time grant writer on staff. It's not even giving them a fair shake at a similar outcome to organizations that have access to those resources. And it is slow moving just because it's such a large apparatus, but I think we're seeing a trend towards that across a large enough number of states that you know, the ship is turning slowly, but it's turning.
Yeah, I'm finding that here, at least in Virginia, there is a real effort, and it's a smart political move too, because one of the things that happens, right, is if the state arts budgets, for example, if those dollars aren't reaching a certain jurisdiction, why would that jurisdiction care to vote in their favor around it, right? And so I think it's smart because if you can get the dollars in every single community, then there's actually something, right, to support and to vote for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's critical that these arts agencies and councils and commissions do that. Elise, how about for you?
I think this theme that we've had throughout about engagement, how it's not just community engagement, it's just part of practice. It just has to be part of running the organization. And I see that there's going to be people that have been doing this job for 40 years and they're saying, yeah, you're not telling me something I didn't know before, right? Like I couldn't have done what I've done for the last 40 years if I hadn't been a part of my community. So duh, right? But great, that person learned it the hard way. So I see more and more this conversation being a surface level conversation, that we don't have to dig deep to have the conversation about the arts as integral to rural communities. It's known. And when that happens, then that's a foundation. We can build on that. And so I do see more and more the conversation of the arts as foundational to the community, as opposed to something that we have to advocate for.
Yeah.
And I work as you mentioned in my bio, across the nonprofit sector. Not just my specialty is arts and culture, but I work across the nonprofit sector. And I find that I can see an actual improvement, and less often am I having to justify the value of those arts and cultural organizations. Less and less am I having to make the case that it's, no, I understand that you're providing medical care to people that need it, but this is also important. I don't have to have that conversation as much. Both are important. Both are valued. And that's really a wonderful place to be. We can build from that foundation if we're not continually having to tread water that, no, we're important, we're valuable.
Yeah.
I promise we're valuable, right? No, we are. And that understanding is more and more prevalent.
Yeah, that's really great to hear, on lots of levels. And, I think, for those in small communities, and we can make the case for the arts in lots of directions too: economic development, quality of life, all of that. But it's good to hear that some of those things we keep beating the drum of are actually landing now and establishing themselves in a really, really clear way. One thing I wanted to see from you all too, so I just interviewed a woman named Kate Decker, who runs a CDC in Oklahoma, really small community. And we started to have a little bit of conversation about succession planning. And I did notice, you all had a little bit about, well, maybe not a little bit, but you have a chapter that deals with human resources. And one of her concerns, and this is not an artist or an arts administrator, she runs a community development corporation, but she identified during the housing crisis in 2008 that communities that had the arts tended to weather these moments better. And so she decided that that her town in Oklahoma was going to have the arts, and so she set out to make this happen. And Kay is like a really special woman, just tons of energy, cares deeply about where she lives. She's from there, right? This is a recurring theme too here. From there, people know her. I mean, she told a story, one of these classic stories too, right, that resonates with this theme, where they were taking over an old building to turn it into an art center, and they know the banker, so they go to the banker, and they had to figure out who owned the building, but they knew the owner because they were tied to somebody else, and they connected back and figured it out and got it sold to them for very little and were able to convert it. But it took, this special woman, who was from there, cares a lot, had the vision to turn this over. But she's approaching retirement age. And, she talked about her, wondering, would somebody else take the torch and carry on, or is this really dependent on an individual with a lot of energy and vision? Can we create a sustainable ecosystem? So I think as we wrap, what I'd love to ask you all is your thoughts on what institutions, people, communities can do to create longevity and sustainability that isn't just dependent on the Kay Deckers of the world, who just have a lot of energy and get out there and make it happen, or that we can build on Kay Decker's work, I guess maybe too is the thing. But thoughts on that?
I actually was just having this conversation earlier today with someone, and this is it's called founder syndrome. This is in the nonprofit sector. This is something that we deal with. When someone has been doing a job for a long time, and all of the institutional memory of how to do that job is in their brain, and that brain for any reason is no longer accessible to that organization, a lot is lost. And this has to be part of planning. It's got to be done at the board level and at the staff level. And it can be as basic as a how-to manual for how to be the executive director of this organization. But the other part of that is, that's like functional, right? We've functional. It has all of the passwords that we need. It has our grant timelines. It has those things that are very practical that are necessary. But the other side of that is, here we go again, engagement. If we have been engaged in our community, if we have been relevant to our community, then we are valued by our community. They don't want to lose the organization when that person is gone. And I will use the specific example. When I was living in that small town in South Central Kentucky, I founded an organization, and I was the organization to the community, right? I was the face of it. My cell phone number was the organization's phone number, right? And I have not lived there since 2017, and that organization is going on without me because the organization was valuable to the community. I hope that I can take some credit for building that relevance and building that, I was part of it, but it was able to outlast me because of the community structures that I built up and was part of building up around with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And probably, and the ability to talk about it, I think is also a thing. And I hope, you do want the institution to outlast the leadership, and it's probably important for everybody to have that conversation, even though it's not always the most comfortable conversation, or even have the bandwidth to have the conversation often, right? Because people are working so hard and so busy. Jerome, as a final note, any any advice that you might give from to somebody in the arts field out there right now in a rural community, something that is most important? I think we're kind of circling up on some common themes here, so we may be running dry, but a final articulation on what we want people to take away from this book.
I think, and this actually ties in nicely with what Elise just said. Do not feel you need to be a hero, because when you have someone, and people who start arts organizations, wherever they are, these are extraordinarily driven people. They know their vision. They're going to make it happen. And frequently what we see is those folks just say, oh, well, that needs to get done. Well, I can do that. Oh, that needs to get done. I can do that. And they take on these superhuman workloads that then build no organizational infrastructure. And so when they move on in whatever sense, all of that work is just there unaccounted for. And when I say don't feel the need to be a hero, that's not to say don't do the work, because the work is there to be done, and it's needed and it's wanted. But we've talked repeatedly about the importance of community here. One of the things that really defines these spaces and makes them such a wonderful place to be making and experiencing art and culture is that there are people there to experience it with. Do the work, but find the people to do the work with. Make sure that you're actually developing something along the way, so that when your time there comes to an end, it doesn't just fall apart. From the jump, make sure that you are engaging other folks, and you're not just shouldering it all yourself. That's the way you make something that lasts, and that's how you ultimately make the sort of long-lasting impression on your community that we're all sort of hoping for.
That's great. Well, I want to encourage everybody to pre-order Rural Arts Management on June 19th. That'll be available. And Elise, when's the release date? It's July?
July
correct?
10th.
July 10th. It will be officially released. So make sure to pick this up, Routledge.com. And I am so excited by this book. It is going to be so helpful to so many in the field. And I also hope it becomes a component of a lot of arts administration curriculum out in the United States, because I think, we have a massive portion of our population in the United States live in smaller communities. Yeah. And these communities need and should have the arts, and they're fantastic vehicles for connectivity, identity, communication, and we should be also providing for future arts administrators a sense of opportunity in these smaller communities as well. That the urban market is not the only option or choice that you have. You can be very important and critical to your smaller community. Well, y'all, thank you so much. Anything else we should point people in a direction of while I have you in regards to your scholarly work, the book, and anything else in the field you're doing right now?
Just go patronize rural arts organizations.
Amen. Yeah. Good. Well, y'all, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And again, Routledge.com, Rural Arts Management. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Small Town Big Arts. Remember to rate and review us and share with your friends. To learn more, visit us at smalltownbigarts.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Jeffrey Kirshner.